First of all, Rahim is actually a very dear and good friend, and I've known him for over 10 years, and I feel very lucky that we have him with us. But more formally, Rahim Thar is a clinical social worker and a psychotherapist who has lived and worked in Toronto, or Takaranto, said in Indigenous languages, for most of his life, and currently lives in Winnipeg, or Treaty 1 territory. He provides consulting services and clinical supervision in his private practice, along with being a sessional lecturer in the sexuality studies department at St. Jerome's University and the University of Waterloo, and at the Factor in Wintash Faculty of Social Work in the University of Toronto. Rahim is also a community organizer with Salim Canada, a volunteer-run organization that supports LGBTQ Muslims nationally. His approaches to psychotherapy, teaching, and community development continuously considers and examines the intersection of systemic oppression and mental health. His most recent full-day training for service providers was entitled Same Labels, Different Determinants, which explores shame, body image, substance use, and relationships as specific determinants of queer men's mental health, He's also contributed and edited the book, Any Other Way, How Toronto Got Queer, and more recently posted 3 articles in the Spectrum Journal on fear and fluidity. Welcome, Rahim, to CSRF. I hope you'll come back.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Carm. It's a bit embarrassing to hear all of that about me, but I guess it's great. All right. Carm, just give me a thumbs up to let me know you can see my slides. All right, thanks, Natalie. So my name is Rahim Thar. I'm a social worker. My pronouns are he and him. I have adapted this talk that was initially intended for a room full of sex therapists. But Carm and Robin Milhausen had saw this and said, Rahim, let's see how you can adapt it for researchers. And of course, I had a lot of anxiety because, well, researchers are intimidating. They have access to a kind of language that I don't necessarily know, like I don't know how to decipher all the time. But nevertheless, I'm here. And I want us to think about how biases and issues of identity and lack of acknowledgement or awareness of issues of identity impact the kind of research we produce and the kind of therapy we provide. So I'm going to use some of my social work skills to guide us through an experience where we can hopefully consider some identity-based social location questions in the context of research. And then I'm going to do something similar in the context of therapy. Now you might ask, what does a therapist know about research, particularly one who doesn't have a PhD? Well, I've worked in a lot of nonprofit agencies over the last 10 years, all very much tied to sexuality, on a health team that serve specifically LGBTQ folks and in the HIV sector. I've sat on numerous advisory committees for research and actively participate in research as a participant regularly. Now, as a therapist, I'm often caught between research and application, and I think acknowledging what I'm not, but what I do know might illuminate some of the research you folks out there in the audience do. I also know that as a racialized queer Muslim, I am inundated with recruitment messaging from researchers. And so there's an experience and there's a lens there about what gets missed and how people out there might view you. And that's not, it's not a dig at the work you're doing, it's just something to think about. Now, what does a therapist bring to research, right? I think that sitting in a room face-to-face with people and doing group facilitation means that I have no choice. We as therapists have no choice but to consider where people are at. And if I miss the mark, there's an embedded system of accountability right there. Someone will tell me, or they won't come back to session. Or I will go to clinical supervision and talk about what I think is going very well, and somebody will help me see my blind spots. Or I will talk about what's not going so well, and someone will help me do some self-awareness and self-interrogation. So those are skills I hope to bring to you today in this session. I also want to exercise the skills around self-reflexivity. Reflexivity is not the same as being reflective. I can reflect on anything. We can go to the mall, although really we shouldn't do that right now, but let's say we did. We went to the mall, we could reflect on what that experience was like. I saw this person, I wanted to buy that, I controlled my impulse around so-and-so, I wish you didn't eat all my fries. That would be a reflection, right? Reflexivity is about combining reflection with knowledge and awareness of your subject position. So how did it feel that we were there together? How were we received based on how we show up in the world? And how is it that based on how we look in our past experiences, we might have experienced them all differently than other people? So it's about reflecting on experiences we're having and our experience in the world, while also acknowledging our subject position, the limits and beauties of what we see and what we don't see. As a therapist, I'm also in contact with a wealth of qualitative and narrative information about people's lives. And part of what's demanded of me is also to synthesize it. So I don't get to code it the way, in a systematic way, the way some of you might, but I'm really interested in synthesizing information. I just do it from a different lens. And so for the research exploration portion of this presentation, I'm treating you all, well, those of you that are researchers, like my clinical supervision clients, okay? And so my intention is not to tell you how to do research, because I can't tell you how to do that. You're already experts on that, but rather to guide you to think about who you are in the world and how that impacts how you engage with other people and the questions you pose through your research projects. So I created a little mock research study, and don't laugh at me, it's probably not as sophisticated as a real study you might come up with, right? So initially, I'm thinking about a design, a quantitative method study to explore drivers of gay men's sexualized drug use. Sexualized drug use just means drug use, substance use in the context or for the purpose of enhancing sexual experience. What are my measurement tools? Well, I'm interested in using the sensation seeking scale, the Beck depression inventory, because like you have to use that for everything. We just constantly do that. Sometimes therapists don't even know why they're doing it and they do that. So I imagine researchers have a few tools of a similar nature. And then the sexual excitation and inhibition scale and the internalized homophobia scale. Now you can tell based on some of the scales I picked that I'm interested in things that might not be going so well for a person interpersonally, that might connect to their experience of sexualized drug use, but also I'm interested in things about them and things that they look for in the world, just like adventure, sensation, to be disinhibited, that might also be connected to their use. And of course, I would need a sexual history questionnaire to contextualize some of the responses. So that's my basic non-researcher design. And the next stage would be to recruit. What's the study without recruitment? And so as it would go, we would develop some posters and circulate it on all of our social media platforms. So Facebook, Instagram, and of course, through local HIV/AIDS organizations or an organization that's connected to gay men. Then we have data collection and management. So let's say we recruited 40 participants and 30 of them happened to be Caucasian and 10 were men of color, 4 East Asian, 4 South Asian, 1 Middle Eastern, and 1 who identified as Black Caribbean. I don't know what to do with that yet, but we'll talk a bit more about why this matters, and we'll go into that in a minute. Now, what were my findings? Well, and again, this is hypothetical, but let's say I found that sexualized drug use was more likely in men with low to moderate sexual excitation and high sexual inhibition scores. That kind of makes sense, right? It takes you a lot to get sexually excited, and you have a difficult time letting go, so to speak. So that would make sense. 2, all participants scored highly on the depression scale, though we don't know if that was their baseline depression or if it was substance induced, right? So we can't say a lot about that. And there was no significant relationship between internalized homophobia and sexualized drug use. So boom, this is my mock study. Now, I want us to go back to this mock study and analyze it at every step of, at every stage of the research process. Now, forgive me, the things that I have to say now are more in line with my expertise in the study that I make believe created to make this point. So when we think about the design, right, I think right off the bat, we need to think about what it is we're doing. We are producing knowledge. And I think there's a huge responsibility that comes with producing knowledge, right? And if I'm going to produce knowledge, I have to think about where it's coming from, right? So you want to talk about sexualized drug use among gay men. Well, I would ask the researcher, what is your sexual orientation and what is your racial identity? Why is that important? Well, I would be very curious to know, in a pool of gay men, of diverse gay men, where you fit. It's not enough that you identify as gay. It's not, because that's such a diverse group. So I wouldn't want other people out there in the world to read your study as a gay man and to think that you inherently have a sense of connection to this community and know what you're talking about when it comes to this particular research question, okay? Because we're such a diverse group. And your racial identity is going to mediate how you understand the research question and how you design it in terms of the tools you use and the questions you ask. So my other question would be, what is your connection to sexualized drug use, right? If the connection is from some kind of distance, right, that is of course okay. But if it's voyeuristic, the results aren't going to be helpful for anybody in the community who's struggling with sexualized drug use, right? If it's voyeuristic at the outset, that means that there's a curiosity that hasn't been grounded in something that the larger community is looking for. And so it's going to be difficult to ask the right questions or to target the right people. I also wonder what the researcher's proximity to gay men's communities looks like, right? I've met a number of queer researchers who are really interested in digging into some of the issues in the community and supporting communities around things that are going on, particularly around mental health. But if they're too removed, there's a lot of relationship building that's going to have to happen. I've also been interviewed by several, okay, I'm exaggerating, but at least two psychology researchers who have interviewed me in a way that I thought was quite leading. So they have this language around, so imagine a white, pretty gay psychologist man who is interviewing me and asking me about body image and drug use, for example. I've had multiple experiences where the researcher is slowly trying to lead me and feed me information in a language that's very structural. So something like, Rahim, don't you think you maybe do this because of this structural reason? Because, you know, you're combating discrimination or chronic stress or minority stress. And I think, what is your proximity to this larger community? Because I understand the language you're using, but that's not how I talk about my day-to-day experience. And for you to feed me that information is inappropriate and shows me that your proximity to this community is about proving a hypothesis and not actually exploring people's experiences. And I find that offensive, personally, right? And so this is why I think people who are even within a community, if we're going to really recognize our communities as being heterogeneous and of diverse experiences, we need to question and just do some interrogation about what our proximity is to the people we want to be studying. I think at the outset and the design, we need to ask which groups and organizations are interested in the research question. Are we going to develop the question and then find an organization or group who cares and wants to support our cause beyond just supporting our recruitment? Or did our question emerge from a series of community consultations around what it is that people want to know in a realm that matches our area of interest or scope of practice? And then finally, what are your intentions and assumptions at the outset about accessing a racially diverse sample? Do you think that they're just going to come to you? Do you think that they owe you something? Do you think that, well, of course they would want to participate because this is going to benefit them too? You don't know that, right? And I think sometimes, in my experience anyway, I've seen researchers approach community organizations hoping that that community organization can do some of the heavy lifting of making sure a sample is representative. Unfortunately, nonprofit organizations struggle with systemic racism too. So they're not in touch with the people you want to be in touch with. And then, of course, how and who will your findings serve? And we will come back to that. I want to talk a little bit about recruitment, this recruitment process. We have to ask ourselves, do we have an existing relationship with the community organizations that serve the people we want to study, right? And if we don't have an existing relationship, how do we make that happen? I've seen far too many people approach organizations in a cold calling type of way, and organizations that are limited in resources actually don't have the capacity to vet all of the different people coming through wanting to use their client population to distribute surveys, right? So how can institutions build relationships with the stakeholder organizations so that individual graduate researchers, for example, or independent researchers aren't approaching the same organization many times, right? Organizations often don't have the capacity to come up with a policy or process for how research is conducted. And I think that leaves a lot of client populations very vulnerable, right? If I worked at an organization that doesn't regulate who I send their call out to, who's going to manage or who's going to govern my behavior as a therapist if I'm acting as an arm of somebody else's research? There's a conflict of interest there. Or at least there's a dual relationship, right? There's potential of a boundary violation. So I think there's a number of things to think about on a meso level. And if we're building relationships in community and we're committing to some level of community-based research, or seed sampling, or no, so it's not seed, snowball sampling, or I've heard some of the terms. We have to also know what the relationships of men of color are to mainstream organizations, right? And not because mainstream organizations are racist, but because mainstream organizations are racist. So it's no one person's fault, but we're not where we want to be, right? And so I see time and time again, in communities of color where we're talking about mental health, queer sexuality, mental health of racially diverse queer men, sexualized drug use. Over and over, the recruitment, the researchers are finding challenges with recruiting participants, right? And they often rely on workers in HIV/AIDS organizations who have a million things to do, and representing the researcher is something they're not always able to do well. And they're not able to do it well because they don't know what's in it for them. It feels like another deliverable that's not actually a deliverable. When we recruit, do our recruitment materials actually speak to men of color? Now, I've seen lots of people shift their posters to include men of color or to add a token person of color. And I have to say that may be helpful, but I think the politics of mere representation falls short when it comes to recruitment. So one, we need to have some solid relationships. We need to figure out how to bridge those on many levels. And then when we're leveraging those relationships, we need to think about what is our medium of communication and what are we conveying to people. It's okay to have a poster that's entirely men of color or have a token white person. White people tend to not feel left out of things. So it would be okay if a city like Toronto, for example, had posters that were all men of color, right? But it's not just that. I think it's language and wording and the types of compensation you offer or the incentives you offer have to speak to people that are marginalized, right? often I said that I'm somebody who participates in a lot of research studies. Well, I have a full-time job, and during the course of my day, nobody's going to bother me if I, take an hour to respond to somebody's research questions. Would I do it if it was just going to give me a $25 gift card? Probably not. It's not very much. It's not very much. And the big question is, why do you even really want a racially diverse sample? Like, I think it's become cool to want that, but I would encourage us to think about, what does it say about us? Does it reflect well on us as researchers and professionals? Does it add to our repertoire and portfolio to have been able to do that? Do we want a racially diverse sample so that our results can be generalizable? Because generalizability is nice, but I kind of, as a gay man of color, I don't care about that much. I would love research that makes some astute analyses by race. I'm asking for like conclusions about the diversity of my people, right? And it's going to be hard to do if I'm only a portion of the people and I get lumped in, South Asian gets lumped in with East Asian, or South Asian gets lumped in with Middle Eastern, and you even take up the popular acronym of BIPOC. It doesn't mean anything if there's no astute analysis about what those things mean. As somebody who has participated in a lot of research, part of what I think is, hey, you know what? I wonder if this is a disservice, because there's other people out there like me who are embedded in organizations or embedded in community in particular ways and have access to knowledge and language about who we are and structural issues we face as a community. It might be a disservice for you to interview me as part of your research. I might, in fact, spew out a kind of rehearsed narrative about structural inequity that you want to hear, right? And Gayatri Spivak talks about the strategic essentialism, right? How I might locate myself as a marginalized person and talk about myself in more regressive, primitive, or fixed ways in order to relate to you as somebody I understand as a more dominant person consuming something that I'm producing, right? So I think as I see a bunch of requests coming through Salam Canada, through my work with the Alliance for South Asian AIDS Prevention, through my work on an LGBT health team, sometimes I'm being interviewed for the same thing many, many times. And I know that some of the other people being interviewed are also frequent participants of research studies, right? Why do we do it? What is that bias about? And how does that skew the results? Now let's talk about data collection and management and findings. Right? So I think at the outset, it makes sense to have some targeted efforts to get way more participants than you need for your study. But also, if you're anticipating or want a racially diverse sample, I think from the outset, it makes sense to do targeted efforts to get there, right? And that could be adapted messaging. It could be unique questions. It could be a number of things. What I would say I find leaves quite a bad taste in my mouth as a community organizer and research and therapist is when I'm on an advisory committee and then the principal investigator gets in touch with the committee and says, you know what, we don't have enough men of color in our sample. Let's extend the timelines and let's do another round of recruitment. It's too late. I'm sorry, but it's too late. There's some important things that have been missed. Right? You didn't reach that community because your study wasn't designed for them. It wasn't designed with them in mind. It wasn't designed to help them. They didn't see it as liberating, or it didn't offset all the other chronic stressors that they have to deal with and make it valuable enough for them to participate. So let's say you do get a small sample of racially diverse folks, right? Because it happens, because it rarely happens. What does this expose about your design, the researcher, the actual needs of the population, and the process of othering, right? So if you have a sample size that's just got very few men of color, and you don't feel comfortable drawing any conclusions, and you probably shouldn't, but let's say you're not drawing any conclusions about them, and my question is, does that piece of research then reinforce positions of men of color to be on the margins? Because the research is essentially about white gay men engaging in sexualized drug use, right? there's no opportunity to make a central or to make any astute observations about the men of color in the sample. And so what do you do with that, right? And I would argue that it inadvertently relegates us to the margins and contributes to a process of othering. When there is data that's found, I think if we believe that marginalized communities are heterogeneous communities, I think it's extremely important that those communities help us interpret the data, right? I think that researchers can be leading. They don't need to be completely, they don't need to be a total blank slate, but I think getting people to contribute, to make connections between what could be correlations can be very important, right? So that we're not ascribing meaning to research findings from a Eurocentric white lens. Now, to that end, we talk about sampling and we talk about reaching men of color. And I'll tell you personally, even though I'm not a researcher, one thing that I really like about research and the reasons I'm invested in it to some degree is because lots of people I meet say that their research interviews are the first time they get to talk about something deep. So they're not coming to therapy, they're meeting a lot of you folks, and that one-off session is actually an intervention for them because they get to talk about something, right? So if we're going to ask about race as a category, we need to appreciate that it's a constructed category, and how we understand racialization as an experience is going to differ between clients. And I think that's something that needs to be examined a bit further. So when I think about race and class and knowledge production, some of the issues that I think that need to be put forward are pretty simple, but I just want to put them forward. I think quantitative research is super valuable, but not objective, right? If it were, we wouldn't need critical race theory. And critical race theory is very hesitant to become quantitative and turn into quant crit because it doesn't want to be eroded, right? So I think it's the work of people who are doing quantitative work and people who are doing CRT to come together and figure out how do we ask good questions that center the experience of marginalized people and not have analysis of people of color's responses as an afterthought. And then as we embark on a process of reflexivity, my question is, are you non-racist or anti-racist, right? And how does this influence your research methods and analysis? Like the non-racist person doesn't want to cause harm, but is not necessarily addressing issues head on of social injustice. Whereas the anti-racist person is doing a lot of things to change the system within which they're working to center certain experiences. Now, when it comes to race and the category of race, the construction of race, what are we looking for? So even if 80% of the men in that study on sexualized drug use were men of color, what does that mean? What does race connote? What are we looking for? What's the nuance? What's the meaning, right? Does race say something about chronic stress and discrimination? Can race be tied to immigration history of the individual and the family? Does race tell us something about the function or the role of internalized racism in a study where we're talking about potentially problematic drug use? Does race indicate, or does it point to both disparity in access to services or disparity in terms of access to healthcare, and also illuminate unique forms of resilience that we don't look for in broader populations, right? I always wonder if someone is doing research on racial minorities, nobody asks me what my religious affiliation is and whether or not that's a source of resilience. I mean, I'll be honest, it's a source of stress, but it could be a source of resilience, right? And I think that needs to be asked because, I don't have the luxury of dismissing my religious affiliation in a white supremacist society. And so it's part of my stress and my resilience, right? And that can get missed. And in the, Euro-American imagination, not all religion, but Islam certainly is racialized. And when we talk about race and we think about race as a diverse category, what are the class differences of people responding to our surveys and our studies beyond income? I always find it interesting that research asks you to check a box around income, but to me, class is so, I find it to be so intricate. When I work with clients, they're often talking about their behaviors in present day being a response to what they had or didn't have growing up, right? So class on a continuum and social mobility, whether it's upward or downward, I think has a big influence on behavior. And poverty is often racialized. Access to opportunities are also, they're often a racial and gendered phenomenon, right? So I couldn't tell you how you need to modify your study, but I can say that I think where income is concerned, I think more analyses can happen between class background and the experience of racialization. Finally, you know, a lot of our methods, so surveys, scales, they're white. They're rooted in whiteness, right? And so I think they could be easily adapted, but I haven't seen many folks, and I could be mistaken, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't seen many folks do survey research where they take a small sample of individuals and go through the survey tools or the test measurement tools and get people's responses to see what meaning they make of those questions or how they read them or how they could be read from various cultural perspectives. Right? I don't think it needs to be a whole study to establish the validity of a tool. A tool can be valid and still not be responsive to the community you're trying to work with, right? So I think those slight adaptations can be hugely helpful. Now, there's part of the research process that doesn't always get talked about. It does when I see people doing community-based research, but you'll have to pardon my ignorance. I don't know how often it's done in other forms of research. And that is a concrete plan around dissemination of findings and knowledge translation, which to me feels like a huge part about the impact research can have on our communities, right? So when things get published, I think we just have to be honest about who benefits, right? And it's okay to benefit. We live in a capitalist world. It's okay to produce knowledge and put your name on it and get credit for it. But how else can we have communities benefit? And if dissemination is an afterthought, do we have time for it? Do our departments give us time to do conferences, to produce manuals, to work with community partners? For those who are less familiar with the term, knowledge translation is about making research accessible, right? So many of us in this room probably went through our undergrads going through journal articles and skimming through the findings and spending a lot of time in the discussion section, right? So knowledge translation is about taking the discussion section and turning it into something that is a health promotion tool or an advocacy tool in the community. So it could be at a community level, it could also be at a policy level, right? And the critical question is, who will fund and supply the knowledge translation pieces, right? Where does the researcher's work end and the community's work begin? And what is the overlap? And is there a possibility of talking about that right at the outset, right? And I often wonder if researchers can become program consultants for nonprofits so that we're acting less in silos, right? I'm often trying to figure out what kinds of groups or what kinds of methods or interventions work best with particular populations. If I want to work with, if I want to teach sexual diversity or issues of sexual diversity to a particular group of people, what does the research say I could do or I should do? I have no idea, right? I'm going to go and do it. I'm going to fly by the seat of my pants. A lot of people are going to like it, but it's going to be lost. There's no institutional memory at the organization I work for. And when I leave, I will take the materials I produced with me. And nobody will have stepped in with their expertise to evaluate it, right? And I think if we work together, the research can inform the intervention I do, and then the researcher can help evaluate the intervention I'm doing. And we can both get some credential for evidence-based work. I particularly think this is useful in working with communities of color because we have a hard time sticking to the quote unquote gold standards of things like CBT, right? Or short evidence-based interventions. Often we're operating from a model of practice-based evidence, right? And we're doing experiential work and we're mixing modalities and interventions. And it would be so helpful to have the eye of a researcher to help us produce some of that and evaluate some of it. So I'm going to shift over and talk a bit about biases in therapy, okay? And you'll notice I'm much more comfortable with the language in this section because I'm not just thinking about my own reflections, but actually I've done a lot of personal interrogating in my own work, right? So it's going to be a slightly different lens. So as clinicians, and I know there's some of you out there, I see you. Here's some questions for us to reflect on as we do this work and we think about social location and social identity in clinical practice. Have you explored your own attitudes towards receiving help in therapy and psychopharmacological intervention? This is very, very important. I'm not saying you have to be in therapy, but I want to know why you haven't, right? And what does it feel like for you to tell mom and dad or your partner or whomever that you're in therapy or that you're on 100 milligrams of sertraline, right? What does it feel to say that out loud? What does it feel like to receive that kind of help? And can you both be a receiver of services, be critical of the system that they operate in, right? Way too many of us are, I can say that, way too many of us are on medication, and medication is a neoliberal strategy in a terribly capitalist world that, you know, pharma companies benefit from, and I need medication, right? So can you be all of those things and bring all of those truths to the table? Do you have a critique of the DSM in absence of actual knowledge around diagnostic labels? Because I find that, you know, at least for me as somebody who's come from a social work background, we've been given a lot of skills and tools to do a systemic analysis of things that are wrong in our system. But in doing so, we paint the strokes almost too broadly because we miss talking about some foundational things, right? So I say to people, you don't have to love CBT, but you should learn how to do it. You don't have to use the DSM. You can criticize it, but you should know a little bit about it before you're criticizing it. And what efforts do we make to make diagnostic labels relatable and useful for clients we work with, right? That's our work. Not to collude with clients in hating the system, and then not to collude with the system and defend diagnostic labels that aren't helpful. How do we play that intermediary role? There's a lot that goes on there that has to do with power, our subject position, and our intuition about the impact, not our intuition, sorry, our insight about the impact of labels. And where do you fit in a larger system that frequently overdiagnoses and misdiagnoses racialized, disabled, and other marginalized people? I'm not gonna lie, I love a good diagnosis. I scream for joy when somebody is appropriately put on ADHD medication. Makes me very happy. But who gets sent for evaluation and who doesn't? Whose behaviors are tagged and labeled as problematic or not fitting into a normative culture? Right? Those are important questions we need to be asking. In the Sexuality, Marriages, and Family course that I'm teaching this term on systemic therapies, coincidentally, it's Carm's course that I'm just borrowing for the term. I've got students to think about the grammar of power in psychotherapy. That's the title of the book, Grammar of Power in Psychotherapy. And they're doing a reflection paper on what it might mean to work with somebody with whom you share a similarity of privilege versus a similarity of non-privilege. And then what does it feel like? What happens in the dynamic, in the field, in the space between you and the patient, you and the client, when there's privilege favoring the therapist or privilege favoring the patient, right? These power dynamics are incredibly important to think about, and they're complex. So I'm going to go into a case study of Reshma. Now, Reshma is 24 years old, lives with her parents after leaving her recent full-time job on extended sick and disability leave. She found the work environment to be incredibly stressful. When probed about specifics, she reports that people weren't bad, but they made her anxious. Mostly, she felt sensory overload due to noises, people pacing, sense, and heightened awareness of her own body, and that's in her work environment. While taking some time away from work, Rishma has made online dating a central focus, but without much success. It's the same old pattern. A guy shows interest on Tinder, they meet for coffee, they might have sex that she doesn't enjoy, and she hopes he'll call back, but he doesn't. She comes to therapy to talk about feeling like a failure. Now, I've got a slew of questions for Rishma, and you may gasp at some of these questions, right? But these are genuine curiosities, unfiltered curiosities that may very well send the wrong message, but here they are. Help me understand this better. On the one hand, you state not being well enough to work, and yet dating is still a priority. In what ways are your pursuits at work and in relationships similar? I ask because I'm wondering if there's a lack of drive or intention around both. Carm just made a face. That says something about what that question might suggest. I'm curious about what stopped you or made it difficult to adjust to your work environment to be more comfortable for you. And are there people you worked with that had challenges more complex than yours? And how did they cope? Now, some of these are a spin on solution-focused questions. I made them intentionally, offensive. But I do that to prove a point. So let's take a look at the clinician curiosity and the message it sends, right? And the microaggressions some of the questions map out onto. But first, I'm going to tell you a bit more about Rishma. What if I told you that Rishma is neurotypical, and following a psychological evaluation, her provider team is querying autism spectrum disorder? Does this change how you think about Rishma? I'll be honest, it did for me. It was hard for me, as somebody who is rather able-bodied, to think about how somebody could let go of their employment and prioritize something else in their life. It was hard for me, as somebody who's born and raised in Canada, to wonder how somebody would go back and live with their family of origin and not try to do everything in their power to get out of that situation. I wondered, how can someone let something like sounds and noises of the printer become such a significant part of why they have to leave a place of employment, right? But when you put into the context that this person experiences the world in a way that's very different from a lot of us, right? And their sensory experience of the world and calm in their sensory environment is a priority. It's a participation need, right? And I try to explain this to some people by saying, imagine if you needed to be chewing a piece of gum every time you were in a lecture just to be able to focus. What would happen if suddenly the lecture was happening 24/7 and there wasn't enough gum around and your jaw started to hurt, right? People have participation needs, and their emotional resources for relying on those needs or drawing on them can also get exhaustive. So when I asked her some of the questions that I did, and I didn't actually ask any of these to a real client, but had I, they would have all mapped out onto common microaggressions people with disabilities face, right? And one of the common microaggressions is a denial of reality because of how the person presents, right? If you don't look like you're sick, if you don't look like you're struggling, I might have a hard time meeting you where you're at, and I'm going to say, I'm going to push you in a way that's not helpful, right? Actually, not unhelpful. I'm going to push you in a way that's oppressive. It would be oppressive. If I'm questioning why somebody would prioritize connection, dating, and sex over employment, one, I've internalized capitalism to the point where I'm denying somebody else's personhood for not participating in the world that they're normatively expected to, right? To recognize somebody as a person is not to evaluate them based on whether or not they're able to work and participate in society as employable, but as somebody who likes to connect with other people. That's the personhood. and to ask how should you be able to, or how do you know about other people's coping strategies and who has it worse? This is common in psychology. People talk about a downward social comparison to make yourself feel a bit better. Well, there's something to it, but in this context, it minimizes the disability or the role of the disability or that it's ever present, right? What needs to be recognized is that this client is living in a world that wasn't designed for her, doesn't meet any of her needs, and the impetus, the onus is on her to figure out what the issues are and then to ask for accommodation. So I think about microaggressions a lot in clinical practice, and just like the development and validation of the ableist microaggression scale, there's a microaggression scale for so many things, right? There's a microaggression scale around anti-Blackness specific to women. There's a microaggression scale around how it feels to be a lone mother, a single mother in the welfare system. There are microaggression scales around race and sexual orientation. And I've seen, articles on microaggressions that trans people experience in counseling settings, right? So if you want any of those, contact me. I have them all. I look into this regularly because I think our curiosity is not neutral. It comes from a position in the world that we privilege as neutral and normal, when in fact it is laden with class, race, and ableist biases. So here are some of my final thoughts. I think objectivity in research and the blank slate in therapy are false paradigms, right? We can try to be objective, right? Certainly, I really like psychodynamic and psychoanalytic therapy. I like the idea of the blank slate, and I like to think about what comes up on, I think about things like projection and what gets projected onto me as though I were a blank slate, but I also recognize that people are responding to what they think I symbolize in the world. So it's not actually a blank slate, it's just a slate. I wonder how we can continue doing research, education, and therapy with integrity while centering values of social justice, right? I really think research is valuable, and what's turned me off of research at times has been the lack of collaboration and lack of conversations about how research and frontline staff can do things, frontline workers can work together, but also how frontline workers can get the help from researchers to answer some of their questions, right? And get their help to evaluate some of their own interventions, particularly interventions that are not super popular or haven't been popularized, because those are the ones we're using with really complex clients, right? I think we must also continually, and I really mean this, continually reflect our own subject position and the bigger picture in the bigger picture, right? What is the cause we're trying to advance here? And what harm is caused if we don't question the systems we operate within, right? If we decide not to pay attention to class and race and disability and sexual orientation, somebody gets harmed, right? And I think those are things we have to think about. Right? What gets reinscribed when we decide not to have those difficult conversations? I think about the therapist who just wants to do good in the world and be a helper or be in a helping profession. And I think about the researcher who gets really excited by numbers. These are both good people, but those motivations need to be tied to a cause if they're gonna do something that's, particularly useful for us as humanity or as a collective people. Finally, can we develop tools and accountability procedures like clinical supervision, survey research, and critically evaluate whose experience is being privileged as normal and neutral in our work, right? I think if I develop a set of like a questionnaire or a checklist, or I design an intervention, I need people to look at them from different social locations, right? The number of times I thought I would be smart enough to develop an exercise or a therapeutic activity for a group of trans guys, and I've been so proud of myself. And then I show it to somebody who belongs to the community, and they have all kinds of things to say about my missteps and what my assumptions are, my assumptions about who they would be attracted to just by the way I worded a certain question, right? And so that reflexivity and the accountability needs to happen throughout those processes. I'm going to leave my presentation there, and I want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank Carm, Natalie, Uzma, and Robin Milhausen for their support in helping me put this presentation together today. And thanks for having me at CSRF.
Rahim, thank you very much. I suspect that